Welcome back, geographers. Today we're diving into some of the most important topics in political geography: challenges to sovereignty. Sovereignty is a country's ability to govern itself, but in today's interconnected world, that's getting harder. Political movements, economic pressures, international organizations, and even social media can weaken a country's control. Think of it like having your own car. Sure, you're in control, but if the gas prices skyrocket, traffic laws change, or someone even takes your aux cord, your independence isn't as strong as you thought. By the end of today's lesson, you'll understand how political, economic, cultural, and technological factors challenge sovereignty, and we'll cover devolution and supranational organizations, economic dependence, and the impact of digital communication. You'll also see real world case studies of sovereignty in crisis. So, in short, we're exploring how the world's rules are constantly being rewritten. So, just to go over a few words that we've already discussed in previous units, sovereignty means the country's control of its land, people, and decisions without outside interference. But maintaining that control is harder than it sounds. A good comparison: think of it as your room in your home. Technically, it's your space, but if your parents decide to set a bedroom or a bedtime or ban food in there, suddenly your sovereignty isn't as strong. Countries face the same struggle, keeping control while dealing with external forces. Next one is devolution, which we discussed previously. This happens when a central government grants more power to local governments, often due to cultural, ethnic, or political pressures. Sometimes it leads to peace, other times it can spark conflicts. So, some examples would be Spain and Catalonia. Catalonia has its own parliament and language, but many Catalans want full independence. Spain, however, isn't ready to let go. Scotland and the UK. Scotland has its own government but remains part of the UK, though independent movements have persisted. And the US and states' powers. The US has a federal system that allows states to make many laws independently, like Florida setting different education policies than California. Okay, so in the past, political change took years to organize. Now, social media can spark revolutions overnight. One example is the Arab Spring, which I'll discuss on the next slide. um, Technology has changed the way that everyone has broadcasted information. So, in the past, sovereignty, a country's ability to control what happens inside of its borders, depended on things like military strength and national barriers, oceans, mountains, and so on. But today, technology is making it harder for countries to control what happens inside of their borders. One example would be the internet and social media. So, government used to control what their people saw on TV or newspapers. Now, the internet allows for people to access information from anywhere in the world. So, one example would be: imagine if a country tries to ban certain news, but people still see it on TikTok, Twitter, or YouTube. Sorry, it's not called Twitter anymore. This can lead protests, political change, or even government crackdowns. Real world connections would be if some countries like China limit internet access, like the Great Firewall, to control what people see. Others, like Russia, use social media to spread government approved messages. And another example would be cyber attacks. Now, this is digital warfare. So, countries no longer just fight with tanks and soldiers, they also attack each other online. Cyber attacks can target governments, banks, or even elections. An example would be instead of invading a country, hackers might shut down its power grid or steal the election data to cause chaos. Drones and surveillance. Satellites, drones, and security cameras also make it harder for governments to hide what they're doing, but they also raise privacy concerns. So, for example, a country can no longer secretly build nuclear weapons because satellites can spot them from space. But at the same time, the same governments use surveillance to track their own citizens. So, an example would be the US and other countries use drones to monitor borders, but in places like China, facial recognition cameras are used to track people's movements daily. Another one would be cryptocurrencies. So, government usually controls the money, but now digital currencies like Bitcoin allow people to send money across borders without governmental approval. So, if a government bans certain financial transactions, people might use Bitcoin to get around the rules. Like in Venezuela, where the government controls the economy, people turn to cryptocurrency to escape inflation and government restrictions. So technology is making things harder for governments to control information, security, and even money. It's kind of like parents trying to limit your screen time, but the students find a way around it, kind of like using a different Wi-Fi. Countries will struggle to maintain sovereignty in a world where technology moves faster than its laws. All right, so like I was talking about, the Arab Spring, and this was protests across the Middle East that were fueled by Facebook and Twitter, leading governments to overthrow uh, in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. Okay, so supranational organizations are an alliance of three or more states that work together in pursuit of common goals. So, the first part we're going to talk about is economic challenges to sovereignty. And this is a country's economic dependence on others, which can weaken its control. So, some examples are Venezuela and oil. Venezuela's economy relied almost entirely on oil. So, when oil prices dropped and the economy collapsed, this led to political instability. China's influence. So, many African nations rely on Chinese investments for infrastructure, giving China political leverage over them. And the global trade agreements. Countries that rely on exports must follow international trade regulations, reducing their economic independence. So imagine if your family owned business, but all of your customers came from one company. If they stopped buying, you're in trouble. Countries face the same economic risks. Okay, so here are some supranational organizations, and we're going to talk about these as we go through this lesson. So some of these countries voluntarily give up their some sovereignty by joining the supranational organizations. These are groups that require members to follow a shared set of rules. So some examples would be the European Union, the EU, and member countries of the EU laws in exchange for free trade and movement. And United Nations, the UN, these are countries that agree to global cooperation, but that means accepting some external influence. Then you also have NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and members of this nation agreements to defend each other. Each limits their ability to act alone in military conflicts. So it's like joining a group project, but with more resources. But you also have shared responsibilities and rules that everybody has to follow. All right. So to explain the UN, so one of the most powerful supranational organizations in the world is the United Nations, the UN. This was created after World War II to prevent future conflicts, and the UN now has 193 member countries working together on issues like peace, security, and human rights. But how does this actually function? So we'll break it down. Key components of the UN would be Security Council, and this is the most powerful body. This is responsible for maintaining international peace. It has five permanent members: the US, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, and then 10 rotating members. The permanent members have veto power, meaning that they can block any action, even if all the other countries agree. Then there's a General Assembly and the main discussion forum where all 193 member states have a vote. And while they can make recommendations, its resolutions aren't always legally binding. And they have an International Court of Justice, an ICJ. So the UN's judicial branch settling disputes between countries, it's kind of like the Supreme Court for international law, but enforcement is tricky because countries can choose to ignore the rules. And then you have sanctions and peacekeeping. So the UN can punish countries through sanctions. These are trade restrictions, financial penalties, or send peacekeeping forces to conflict zones. So, for example, sanctions were placed on North Korea to limit their nuclear program. So the parts of the United Nations, they have their General Assembly. This is like the town meeting of the world. The UN Security, this maintains the peace. It's the most powerful branch. and all members have the veto power. Economic and Social Council, which works with the UN's economic, cultural, health, and educational activities. You have the Trusteeship Council, which deals with territories, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the Secretariat. And this is the administrative duties that can bring any topic before the council. All right, so beyond passing resolutions and holding meetings, the UN has taken direct action in global conflicts through peacekeeping missions and humanitarian efforts. So we're going to look at some of the most well-known UN missions and evaluate the organization's strengths and weaknesses. Major UN missions that we'll cover in East Timor in 1999 to 2002. After breaking away from Indonesia, East Timor faced violence and instability. The UN helped organize elections, train police, and build government institutions to support independence. In Iraq in 91 and 2003 to 2010, the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq after the invasions of Kuwait and later played a role in humanitarian aid and rebuilding efforts after the Iraq War. In Somalia from 1992 to 1995, the UN intervened to provide humanitarian aid during the famine and the civil war, but struggled due to ongoing violence and lack of government stability. And then in Haiti from 2004 to 2017, after political turmoil and natural disasters, including the 2010 earthquake, the UN helped to rebuild the efforts, law enforcement training, and disaster relief. Some of the strengths of the UN, and this is bringing countries together for peaceful negotiation, provides humanitarian aid in a time of crisis, and coordinates global efforts on issues like climate change, health, and security. Some weaknesses would be the Security Council's veto power that allows any of the 5 permanent members to block action, limiting its effectiveness. Peacekeeping forces have limited authority, often relying on cooperation from local governments. Enforcement of the international laws and rulings is not always effective, and countries can choose to ignore the UN decisions. So here is the EU. All right, so supranationalism, it's an alliance of three or more states that work together in the pursuit of common goals, typically regional in scale, but they are globalized like the United Nations. So not all supranational organizations focus on politics. Many are about money and trade, and these organizations allow countries to work together for economic benefits, but they also limit a country's independence and making economic decisions. So we're going to explore some of the biggest economic supranational organizations. First one is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and this was founded in 1967. This is a group of 10 Southeast Asian countries that work together to improve trade, economic growth, and political stability. So some examples would be countries like Thailand and Indonesia. They've benefited from a shared role of trade and trade policies and reducing the costs and increasing profits. Then we have the European Union and the EU, or the EU. They have 27 member countries. They are an economic and political union that allows for free trade, shared currency, the euro for most members, and the movement of people. An example would be a person in Germany can work freely in France without needing a visa. The downside is that countries must follow the EU regulations, even if they disagree with them, which is why the UK left in Brexit. All right, so the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This is a group of oil rich countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iran that work together in control of oil prices and production. If the OPEC reduces oil production, gas prices rise everywhere, including the United States. And then we have the World Trade Organization. So they help countries negotiate trade agreements and resolve disputes over tariffs and exports. An example would be if the US places tariffs on Chinese goods, China can file a complaint with the WTO. So, how would this affect you? Have you ever wondered why certain brands are cheaper than others or why some are more expensive? It's usually because of global trade agreements. If you've noticed gas prices changing, that's the OPEC behind it. And then if your favorite international brand is suddenly hard to find, a trade dispute might be happening. Okay, so political supranationals. Some supranational organizations focus on political and security rather than just trade, and these organizations bring countries together that cooperate on military, diplomatic, and political issues. So we'll talk about some of the most significant political supranational organizations. First one would be the United Nations, and they focus on global peace, security, and human rights. Countries work together, but decisions can be limited by the veto power of five permanent Security Council members: the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. The next one is NATO, and they were founded in 1949. They're a military alliance created during the Cold War to defend against the Soviet Union. Today, NATO members include the US and many European countries, and they agree to protect each other if attacked. The Warsaw Pact was from 1955 to 1991, and the Soviet Union's response to NATO. It united communist countries under the military alliance, but they collapsed at the fall of the Soviet Union. Then you have the African Union, which is the AU, and this was founded in 2001. They focus on peace, economic development, and political stability across Africa. The AU works to mediate conflicts and promote human rights within African nations. Then we have the Arctic Council, which we have mentioned previously. They're a unique organization where countries with territories in the Arctic, the US, Canada, Russia, and Nordic countries, work together on environmental and political issues. So they work on climate change, opening a new Arctic shipping routes. Countries, they have to kind of cooperate with each other to prevent territorial conflicts. So, why does this matter? If your country is a part of NATO, then you're protected by some of the world's strongest militaries. If you live in the Arctic country, policies from the Arctic Council would affect your climate regulations. And if a country is in the UN or the AU, they might have a compromised sovereignty to follow global agreements. All right, so supranational organizations also bring countries together for economic, political, and security cooperation. But like any partnership, sorry, there are benefits and drawbacks. So we're going to talk about both using real world examples. So, first up, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, their economic and political stability, their countries work together to increase trade, improve economies, and prevent conflicts. Their members, like Vietnam and Malaysia, benefit from regional partnerships that help them to grow economically without direct outside interference. A downside is while they promote trade, wealthier nations like Singapore benefit more than poorer ones. And then there's some political instability that's made things difficult for them to have a unified action on human rights issues. Next, we have the African Union, and their regional cooperation and peacekeeping is their main positive, and so they're going to go ahead, positive attribute. And the AU mediates conflicts and provides humanitarian aid. They have helped resolve disputes in countries like Sudan and Ethiopia. The downside would be their dependence on external funding and limited enforcement. Many AU peacekeeping missions rely on outside funding, which can limit their effectiveness. So the AU has struggled to intervene effectively in prolonged conflicts like those in South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Next, the Arab League, and they focus on cooperation among Arabic-speaking nations. It allows countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia to work together on common goals. The downside would be their internal disputes and lack of strong action. Member nations often disagree on policies, making it hard to take unified action. The League has struggled to resolve conflicts in places like Syria and Yemen because members have conflicting alliances. So the Arctic Council helps manage the Arctic's natural resources and protects indigenous communities. Countries like Canada and Norway collaborate on responsible Arctic development. The downside is that countries in the Arctic, they also disagree on how to balance economic development with environmental protection. Russia and Canada want to increase Arctic oil drilling, while Norway and US push for stricter environmental regulations. All right, and we already talked about this. All right, so moving into military supranationalism. So not all supranational organizations focus on trade or diplomacy. Some are built for military alliances and defense. One most important military supranational organization is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has played a key role in global security since the Cold War. So they formed in 1949 during the Cold War to counter the Soviet Union. Currently, it has 31 member countries, including the US, Canada, and much of Europe. Their Article 5 agreement, if one NATO country is attacked, all members have to agree to defend them. And some of their positives would be a collective defense. A small country in NATO has the protection of powerful militaries, including the US and the UK. They prevent large scale wars. Countries are less likely to attack NATO members since they risk the war with the whole alliance. And then there's military cooperation. So member nations train together, share intelligence, and conduct joint military operations. So, some of the negatives, there is a loss of military independence. NATO members must coordinate military actions and may be drawn to conflicts that they don't want. They have unequal military contributions, and the US spends far more on NATO defense than most European members. There's also tensions with Russia. NATO expansion near Russia's borders had led to increased tensions, especially in Ukraine. So, why does this matter? If your country is a NATO member, they are protected by the world's strongest military alliance. If a NATO member is attacked, the US could be pulled into war, and NATO influences global politics, military strategies, and international security. So beyond peacekeeping, diplomacy, the UN also has long term plans to improve global living conditions through Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. And these 17 goals were set in 2015 and aim to address the world's biggest challenges, from poverty and hunger to climate change and education. So, we're going to explore some of the key SDGs and why they matter. So, no poverty and zero hunger. The UN works to reduce poverty and hunger by supporting struggling economies and providing food assistance. An example would be the World Food Program, and they deliver meals to millions of people in crisis zones like war-torn regions of Sudan or Yemen. Then they have quality education, and this is an education is a priority to help break cycles of poverty and inequality. The UNICEF program builds schools and provides resources in countries with limited access to education, such as Afghanistan and parts of Africa. The clean water and sanitation, millions of people lack access to clean water and toilets, leading to disease and poor health. The UN funds clean water projects in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where communities struggle with water shortages. Next, you have climate action, and global cooperation is needed to slow climate change and protect the environment. So the Paris Agreement, a UN-led climate deal, has nations pledge to reduce carbon emissions and use cleaner energy. So, why this matters are if you've ever donated to a charity or participated in a fundraiser for disaster relief, then you've contributed to the UN's global mission. If you care about climate change, global warming policies are directly tied to UN's SDGs. And if you've ever seen a news story about refugee crisis or hunger, the UN is often involved in responding to those emergencies. All right, so next up we have what are the G8 and G20? So, G8 is a group of 8 powerful countries that meet to discuss global issues like the economy, security, and the environment. Think of it like a team of leaders trying to solve the world's biggest problems. The members are the United States, Canada, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Russia. So, imagine if the US, Germany, and Japan got together to discuss how to fight climate change to prevent global financial crisis. That's what the G8 does. The G20 is a bigger group of 20 countries. This includes the G8 members, plus countries like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And they discuss similar global issues, but with more voices and ideas. The G20 includes 19 countries, plus the European Union. Picture the G20 as a giant group chat where countries like India, Mexico, Australia can discuss global issues that affect all of us, like poverty or international trade. So imagine if you and your friends have a big school project and you need to work together to solve your problems. The G8 is like a smaller group, the most involved friends, while the G20 is the larger group with more opinions, ideas, and perspectives, making sure that everyone has a say in how to tackle the problem. Okay, so NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is a trade deal between the US, Canada, and Mexico from 1994 to 2020. That removed most tariffs. So, extra taxes on imported goods to make trade easier. So, for example, imagine if your school made a deal with two other schools so that students could easily buy and sell snacks to each other's vending machines without extra fees. That's NAFTA. But for businesses and products like cars, food, and electronics. The pros of this would be more trade, cheaper products, and stronger economic ties. The cons would be if some US factories move to Mexico for cheaper labor, which leads to jobs being lost in certain industries. So the USMCA, United States Mexico Canada Agreement. In 2020, they updated to NAFTA, and it kept a free trade but added new rules to protect American workers and the environment. So think of it like your school updating the snack trading deal, and now some students get better protection, certain snacks, and have to meet healthier standards. The pros of this would be their protection for their workers, stricter environmental rules, and better deals for farmers. The cons are that some businesses face stricter regulations, and it's still debated whether much of it's better than NAFTA. So the NAFTA and the USMCA are like school trade deals, making it easier to exchange food, but also impacting who benefits the most. Some get cheaper products, while others, like factory workers, might lose out. And it's all about balancing economic benefits and fairness. And finally, sorry, I know this was a long one, guys. Sovereignty is about control, but today that control is constantly challenged by political movements, economics, culture, and technology. So that's a wrap for today's lesson. Remember, geography isn't just about maps, it's about power, identity, and change. Keep thinking critically, and I will see you next class. Don't forget to complete your notes, write down any questions that you might have, and of course, complete your assignments before I see you again. Bye, everybody.